had this job where I literally dressed up as Spider-Man for kids' birthday parties. And the reason why I dressed up as Spider-Man is because I was Asian, and I couldn't show my face. There weren't any Asian superheroes, you know? So I could only play one of those heroes with a full mask. And it's pretty incredible now that, you know, not only is she making it to the big screen, but he has no mask. His face is, you know, is just his face, and he's out there.
On September 3rd, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings came out, making back most of its budget in its first week, and the first successful film since the COVID-19 pandemic. It was a win for Asian people everywhere. It showed us that our Asian identity is important and should be portrayed correctly, and it makes up for all the awful stereotypes since the dawn of media itself, is what I would be saying, but that's kind of oversimplifying it. I love Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. It is probably one of my favorite films this year, my favorite Marvel film in a long time, and the best Marvel film so far in their new Phase 4. And for me, seeing its success, I think there's a lot to unpack about how we got to Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, and the bumpy road to this successful film. So let's begin unpacking Shang-Chi. So, to first understand why this is groundbreaking, we need to talk about comic books history with Asian people. Okay, so before I go into this, I want to just be very clear. My intention about talking about the comic book industry's sordid history with their portrayal of Asian characters and Asian creators in Marvel Comics, or lack of, is not coming out of malice and gotcha hot takes. I love comic books and I enjoy Marvel comic books a lot. One of my favorite characters is Iron Fist, who in my opinion is both cool, but has a backstory that can be considered aggressively problematic. We'll get into that a little later, but that does lead me to the first thing I want to talk about, which is comic books and Orientalism. Okay, so this is now the third time I have brought up Orientalism in my videos in the past 3 months. I talked a little about it briefly in Snake Eyes and then touched on it a little bit more in Raya and Mulan, but when talking about the history of Asian representation in the comic book industry, it's a part of that what made Asian characters quote-unquote Asian. Orientalism refers to the allegedly simplistic, stereotyped, and demeaning conceptions of Arab and Asian cultures generally held by Western scholars. Western culture, poorly characterizing and stereotyping Eastern culture, was there from the get-go. Comic book Asian characters, when Shang-Chi was created, were either poor stereotypes of Ching Chong Man bad or exotic mystical healers, but there's more nuance than just comic book companies being racist. I'm gonna leave it in the link down below, but there is a virtual art exhibit called Marvels and Monsters, Unmasking Asian Images in US Comics 1942 to 1986 by Professor Jack Shen at NYU that shows the portrayal of the Asian stereotypes that were used in comic books from the 40s to the 80s, and I had the pleasure of talking with the man who collected some of the comics for the exhibit, science fiction writer Bill F. Wu, who worked hard trying to explain and have conversations with Marvel through the letters of the editors about things like Shang-Chi and even Iron Fist. Here's what I asked him. Orientalism played a big part of how Asians have been portrayed till just recently, and the exhibit showed that off very well. What inspired you to start curating these images of Asian stereotypes in comics during this era? And this is what he told me. I always had an interest in how we were portrayed in pop culture and later in literature. This probably comes from my mother expressing her opinions of such characters as I was growing up. She made clear she disapproved of the vast majority and pointed out most of such characters were nothing like anyone we knew. I always liked comic books, even before I could read. So when I started collecting when I was older, I bought duplicates when Asian characters were depicted and created a separate collection with them. However, I had no idea what to do with it. I hauled it with me every time I moved without a plan. Eventually, Professor Jack Shen at NYU, an old friend, given that we first had met as teenagers, asked me if I had any materials regarding the Yellow Peril. So that's how the collection went to NYU. They did the real curating of the exhibit. I had boxed the comics according to titles and chronological order, but that's all I did. The stereotypes we had in comics during that time you curated this collection were obviously harmful, but do you think it was from a place of malice or just genuine misunderstanding? And this was Bill's answer. That's an excellent question, and the answer is complex. The easy part of the answer, of course, is that many comics related to wars demonized the enemy. That was often, but not always true, of depictions of Germans as well as Japanese, North Koreans, and Vietnamese. To some extent, this is about national propaganda, but because racial distinctions were involved, it was still a disservice to Japanese Americans, South Koreans, and South Vietnamese, and of course immigrants to the US in the latter two groups. I think many of the hostile depictions of us are based on the assumption that we're outsiders, either not Americans or not fully Americans, as the others showing us as villains is only one easy step away. There's a lot of room to identify misunderstandings, that is, not knowing much about either Asians or Asian Americans, yet misunderstanding alone don't excuse the depictions. They show no sign any of the creators cared. I'm sure the comics creators at the time observed us in the course of their lives, and I doubt they saw people who were much like the Asian characters in their comics. I want to give a nod here to the fact that comics in general are a medium full of exaggerations, and that's a factor also. After that part of the conversation, I started to write this and think about how these characters were made that portrayed Asian people, and while most of these Asian characters were made during the time and resurgence of the Yellow Peril. I talked about the Yellow Peril before in my Warrior video essay, and the Yellow Peril was a form of anti-Asian sentiment and fear-mongering during the 1900s of Chinese immigrants taking American jobs and also destroying the American way of life with their Eastern tradition, to the point that America enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is the first and only law that stopped any race of people from coming to America. Yellow Peril would rise again during the rise of World War II and the fear of the Japanese and the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yellow Peril would then trickle into the portrayal of China and other East Asian countries during the Cold War and America being in Vietnam. So a lot of these characters, like the Mandarin, Fu Manchu, and Radioactive Man, came to be because of all of this. And as I went through this virtual exhibit, I noticed a few tropes that at a glance that could come off as positive but are actually still harmful stereotypes, such as intelligence, being good at martial arts, or master of ancient mysticism. What is a good way to explain how it is still harmful to the Asian identity? And Bill explained it like this. Even the stereotypes that seem to be the most desirable are used to define us for others. That is, we're still being seen as a group of a certain kind and not as individuals. Using cultural matters isn't inherently wrong, but the simplistic depictions pile up. For instance, easy assumptions that most of us must be martial artists are a long way from developing a character who has devoted great effort to martial arts. No one can know when first meeting someone where on the curve an individual's intelligence would land. Having other people base their expectations on stereotypes creates a burden. I enjoyed having this conversation with Bill. He is forever going to be someone I'm going to look up to because he pushed for positive Asian representation at the time where people didn't think about it. As well as this exhibit, which is amazing. Going through it though, I saw every stereotype that Asian characters are portrayed as and sometimes still portrayed as today. The schemers, the master manipulators, the lotus blossoms, and the dragon ladies. As well as portrayal scenes in Doctor Strange comics of the 60s of aggressive Orientalism in a quote more positive manner because Stephen Strange was going to the Orient and learning magic from an ancient and magical guru known as the Ancient One. And you can't forget his lovable sidekick Juan, staples of Asian portrayals in all media. For decades, comic book images of Asians were filtered through historical misrepresentation and colored by fears and anxieties of their time. And that sucks, and it's shitty, and all we can do is try to be better. Yes, a lot of portrayals of Asians came from malice, but we have to talk about these stereotypes and portrayals of Asian people in the media because this shaped how we got Shang-Chi in the comics. Let's talk about the creation of Shang-Chi. Shang-Chi was created during the big Bruce Lee and Kung Fu movie boom known as Chop Saki, which is a play on the Chinese gist Chop Suey, that is a pun of the karate chop, a Japanese martial arts, and the synonym for punch sock. But Shang-Chi was created because the creators, writer Steve Englehart and artist Jim Sterling, were pitching an idea to DC about making a Kung Fu TV show comic book adaptation, but DC wasn't interested in developing that. So they just started to develop a character for Marvel, so they kept the concept of Kung Fu Warrior and started to make it their own. The name Shang-Chi came from the I Ching, using the word Shang, which meant ascending, and Chi being the life force energy. So Shang-Chi So from the beginning, he was built off of some Orientalist tropes and Asian mysticism that the white creators were influenced by. But Shang-Chi is also based off of Bruce Lee in a lot of ways. One influence from Bruce Lee would be the film Enter the Dragon. Bruce played a spy-like character who was also a martial artist. Shang-Chi in his runs worked for MI6, working with British intelligence to bring down his father, the evil Fu Manchu. You can't really talk about Shang-Chi's creation without talking about Fu Manchu. So, who is Fu Manchu? Dr. Fu Manchu was created by English author Sax Rohmer. He consulted with his wife, a known psychic, to use a Ouija board and asked it one question. How could he be successful writing it spelled back to him Chinaman, Chinaman. And from there, Rohmer crafted the villain, Dr. Fu Manchu. Fu Manchu, for the most part, has gone into the realm of obscurity, but he is what I think shaped the stereotypes Asian people have had throughout the years in media they were portrayed in. This is how Fu Manchu was first described. Imagine a person tall, lean, and feline, high-shouldered with a brow like Shakespeare and a face like Satan, a close-shaven skull, and long magnetic eyes. Invest him with all the cruel cunning of an entire Eastern race accumulated in one giant intellect, with all the resources of science past and present. Imagine that awful being, and you have a picture of Dr. Fu Manchu, the yellow peril incarnate in one man. Oh boy, that description is cringe. That is all I can explain it as, it's just cringe. From the Inverse article by Eric Francisco, Fu Manchu, How Marvel Shang-Chi Had to Destroy Its Own Race's Past, they wrote about Fu Manchu's impact in the West. Fu Manchu was created very specifically for dime store penny dreadful thrillers. He represented an entire ideology, a counterweight to Western civilization. From 1923 to 1980, Fu Manchu spawned his own Marvel-like franchise of radio serials, comic strips, and films, played by white actors like Boris Karloff, Christopher Lee, and Peter Sellers. Nicolas Cage even played Fu Manchu in parody form in the 2000 film Grindhouse. In the mid-20th century, Fu Manchu had such an entrenched place in American pop culture that when Marvel writer Stephen Englehart and artist Jim Sterling sought to create Shang-Chi in 1972, Marvel acquired the legal rights to Fu Manchu in the interest of adding heft to Shang-Chi. So Fu Manchu is a rather problematic character that personifies the Western belief of yellow peril. And although it was just an adventure comic like we talked about with depictions of Asian people in media, it means that an audience will still see this, especially young audiences wouldn't understand the undertones of racism and just find it commonplace. When Shang-Chi was first being written, Bill Wu had concerns of both Fu Manchu and how they were going to portray Asian characters, and would end up writing letters to the editors about it. And when I asked him about this scenario, this is what he told me. My biggest objection was the return of Fu Manchu as a character, because Marvel had contracted use of the character and made Shang-Chi his son. Fu Manchu was always going to be in the storyline. He was defined as the Yellow Peril incarnate in the first novel in which he appeared by Sax Rohmer, so the Yellow Peril was inherent to the stories. I liked seeing Doug Munich take the story to a James Bond type adventurist, and he always was very good at it. The less we saw of Fu Manchu, the better I liked it. I once wrote to Doug about how the character Blackjack Tar, a fun play on words by the way, routinely addressed Shang-Chi as a Chinaman. I acknowledged that within the stories this was just between friends and colleagues, but added that younger readers might see the term as being acceptable. I also want to say I know a lot of people, including Caucasian friends, who agreed with my criticisms back then, even if they weren't interested in expressing their opinions the way I did. And during this time, Shang-Chi wasn't the only possible problematic character that used Orientalism to push their stories in Marvel Comics. I mean, it could be said that when there was anything else Asian-related in Marvel Comics, it was used more for an aesthetic choice, or white dude goes to an Eastern country and learns to be better at magic or kung fu than the actual people living there. Examples, of course, are being Doctor Strange, Iron Fist, Wolverine, and why does Psylocke use a samurai sword? Don't Google it, it gets weird. The one thing that I kind of find disheartening is that these editors-in-chief of Marvel at this time were very ignorant, but seem to be very ignorant still about what they did, and who I'm specifically talking about is Roy Thomas. He's the one who created Iron Fist and approved Shang-Chi's creation. These two are Asian-inspired comics using Orientalism, and he tried to defend the whitewashing of Iron Fist and defend Marvel's pushing of diversity. In 2017, when talked about the possibility of Iron Fist being Asian in the new show, he replied with this: "Yeah, someone made me vaguely aware of that. I try not to think about it too much. I have so little patience for some of the feelings that some people have. I mean, I understand where it's coming from, cultural appropriation. My god, it's just an adventure story. Don't these people have something better to do than to worry about the fact that Iron Fist isn't Oriental or whatever word? I know Oriental isn't the right word now either. Now, if something is really racist or degrading to a sex or race, an ethnic group or something like that, that's something else. But Iron Fist isn't that and never has been. It's all about a fictitious race, a fictitious place like Shangri-La, and one person who happens to be its emissary. There's no reason why you can't be Caucasian, because I did want to reach out to all races. Marvel has always pioneered for years in having people of other races in comics, from Black Panther through Luke Cage and a few others. On the other hand, if they had decided to make Iron Fist an Asian, that would have been fine with me too. I wouldn't have cared. I didn't consider myself the safeguard of some kind of Caucasian literary standard or anything like that, but I would have found it easier to write about Caucasians. So that's one reason I probably did it. If somebody had suggested, you want to make it so he's Asian? Well, we could have done that too. Whew, oh boy, that was a lot. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here, and for the purpose of this video, I think it needs to be addressed because of how influential comic books are to the pop culture media we have today. So I want to first talk about his very loaded answer of cultural appropriation and why it matters that Iron Fist is Oriental. The claim of him saying this was an adventure story and it was a fictional place is fine and dandy, but they made a specific thought of making it Asian influence. But what becomes telling is Roy knowingly saying Oriental is not only tone deaf but offensive, which puts into perspective how Roy thinks. One of the claims he said was Marvel was championing heroes of color like Black Panther and Luke Cage, but for a long time these characters were created by white creators meant to sell to a white audience. And to me it becomes null and void, especially after reading the blog post by the first black editor of Marvel, Chris Priest, on his account of prejudice and flat-out racism working at Marvel during this time. Most people in comics are largely white intellectuals. Intellectuals tend to think they're beyond racism because, well, they are intellectuals. They've read lots of books and they have an elevated sense of the commonality of man. Intellectuals tend to look down their noses at guys like Archie Bunker and abhor racism. Intellectuals give to the NAACP and march on Washington and embrace the oneness of the human species. To many of these people, who was first didn't matter, doesn't matter, and won't matter. The fact they do not seem to know is actually some business to be celebrated, that we have moved beyond such distinctions. But wait, we haven't moved anywhere. White intellectuals are incredibly dangerous to the cause of social equality in that they deny the institutionalized nature of racism and sexism in this country. I don't think comics are any more or less racist than any other corporate environment. It's just that as a field, comics is terribly small compared to the publishing. So even 5 racists in comics is a huge demographic statistically, as compared to say racist accountants or racist short order cooks. Ask any white professional in comics who the racists in the business are, and you'll likely get a shrug or denial that there are any. Ask almost any black pro in the business and you'll get the same 5 names. We all know who these people are. Many of us have suffered directly or indirectly from these people, but mentioning the names will get you blacklisted and likely sued. These are people whose racist tendencies are largely ignored by white PDPs, who probably don't even notice them, but these tendencies ring alarm bells of any black within their orbit. It's the dirty secret of comics, the commonly accepted short list of racists every black pro knows and almost no white pros do. The reason why I'm bringing this up is to counteract what Roy said, because Roy Thomas was the editor-in-chief when Shang-Chi was greenlit, and Jim Starlin left after issue 3 of the series, even though it was popular because he found out who Fu Manchu was when Larry Hama, the creator of Snake Eyes himself, who happens to be Asian, told Starling about Fu Manchu's racist origins. Marvel bought the rights to the books without having read them. Finally, somebody said, we ought to read the books. I did, and I was horrified because they were shockingly racist, even for the 1970s, Starling once said. so the fact that even one of the creators left because of it is telling. What is also telling about these comments of Roy Thomas and the accounts of Chris Priest is how Marvel treated their minority writers, which is very gross and disgusting in my opinion. I am not saying Marvel has not had some really good Asian writers. Look at Larry Hama and Jim Lee. So they have had diversity or whatnot. But one of Marvel's most egregious sins to me when it comes to Asian representation in comics aren't the comics itself, but how they treat writers and creatives of minority descent. It is nice seeing that Marvel's Voice Initiative, where I get to see Asian writers writing about Asian characters now. Because up until the talks of Shang-Chi to be a film, he was written by white dudes who like Kung Fu. But Asian writers are far and few in between in the comic books industry. So to finally have Asian writers working on Asian characters is awesome. But that wasn't always the case. In 2017, Cebulski became an editor-in-chief of Marvel. It was then tweeted out by then Image brand manager David Brothers saying this: "Hey Comics Journo friends, we should definitely be asking Marvel and new editor-in-chief Cebulski on how he chose to use a pen name Akira Yoshida in the early 2000s to write a bunch of Japanesey books for them." CB's ruse was so elaborate that he even made up a backstory that he was a child who grew up reading manga and the son of a Japanese businessman who was enamored by American comics when he visited America with his father and opening his first comic book. Who wrote books that were supposed to feel more Eastern, and Marvel knew, and they resolved the situation behind closed doors. But Marvel denied the fact that CB and Yoshida were the same person for years, with people like then Marvel editor Mike Martz claiming he had lunch with Yoshida and they talked about fucking Godzilla. Which brings up the point that Marvel was okay with just being Asian enough because Yoshida was listed as one of Marvel's Asian voices for a very long time. Comic scholar and critic Kelly Kanyama said this about CB's Japanesey stories. Cebulski presented a vision of Japanese culture that was just different enough to seem exotic, but that aligned with Western biases about what Japanese culture and Japanese people were really like. And to play devil's advocate, a few Asian writers have gone to his defense because CB had lived in Japan and helped a lot of Asian writers get their shot, which is fine and it's admirable, but it's still gross and creepy what he did. And something that sticks with me is this quote from Keith Chow, a co-editor of Asian American Comics anthology series Secret Identities and Shattered, when I hear people defending him. There has always been a preponderance of Asian American artists because that's the only merit-based aspect of the industry, but the editing and writing is where authentic stories come from. Artists of color can draw white heroes as well as white artists, but we barely get a chance to write those heroes, people of color or not. The reason all of this stuff is being brought up in the Shang-Chi video essay about the film is that it took almost 50 years for the Asian comic book character to be written by people of Asian descent, who can tell their experiences of being Asian in America and reflect them in their stories, with things like Ms. Marvel, Agents of Atlas, and now even Iron Fist. I am bringing this up in a video about unpacking how we got the film Shang-Chi because these are also factors in the film's creation. Shang-Chi was created in a very problematic era, and the film tries to cut those down and rebuild Shang-Chi as not white dudes thinking what Asian people are like, but Asian writers getting an avatar to tell an Asian story. Before we could talk about the film, we need to unpack another thing, and that is the portrayal of Asian superheroes, or lack thereof, in Western TV and movies. Before Shang-Chi came out, people like me said that we were super excited to see an Asian superhero that seems like a positive representation. Then, people, usually shitty white nerds, like to go, well, actually, there's Bruce Lee or Jackie Chan. And I would say we look at them now as breaking barriers for Asian representation in America, but rewatching their American films, mind you, they kind of come off very shitty portrayals of Asian people and kind of feel like it's a little bit of tokenism. Rewatch Rush Hour and then we can talk. But we can't talk about Asian superheroes and the rise of Shang-Chi without bringing up Bruce Lee anyways. Like I said, a lot of people, let's call a spade, who just want to be kinda shitty and maybe a contrarian because, well, actually, this is what it is. We'll wave Bruce Lee as Kato being the first Asian superhero, which fine, let's talk about that. Bruce Lee was the first Asian superhero, with an asterisk, because he wasn't a superhero. He was the Green Hornet's valet and sidekick. I already went into this before when I made a video defending Seth Rogen's Green Hornet. Bruce Lee's Kato was a badass, but that's all he was. And also the Green Hornet's butler and valet. Though in real life, Bruce Lee and the actor of the Green Hornet Van Williams were friends, the show kind of made them work more like work associates. And behind the scenes, the industry wanted to tokenize Bruce Lee and his martial arts. Bruce's appearance was the first showing of Kung Fu on a national level, and the producers knew that. Bruce Thomas wrote this in a book called Bruce Lee Fighting Spirit. He put limits on how far he was prepared to exploit his skills, even at then the handsome fee of $1,000 or more per appearance, wrote Thomas. He exclaimed again and again that he had no time for tricks like breaking boards, adding boards don't hit back. Although he was mobbed by enthusiastic fans during these public appearances, he was hardly getting his face known by appearing as Kato, wearing a mask. So yes, Bruce Lee as Kato was a stepping stone, but he didn't reach superstardom until he left to make films for Hong Kong and Bruce Lee mania actually began, making full circle how Shang-Chi was made. Hollywood didn't think he was sellable by himself because he was Asian. I'm not here to either besmirch what he did, but it feels like when people use Bruce Lee as an argument to counter people being happy that Shang-Chi is an important milestone for Asian representation, it just kind of comes off pretty shitty. Because a recent online survey in May just asked a simple question of if they could name a prominent Asian American, the most common answer was don't know, which was 42%, followed by Jackie Chan, which was 11%, and Bruce Lee, which was 9%, which McYikes, because Jackie Chan isn't Asian American. And then through the 70s and 90s, Asian superheroes were far and few in between, besides the occasional tokenism that was in things like Super Friends with Silver Samurai, who was a samurai who controlled wind. It wasn't till the 90s where there was a little animated series called X-Men and we got Jubilee, the plucky teenager of the X-Men. I loved Jubilee a lot as a character. She was an Asian character that was part of a main team and had stories centered around her. And then Asian representation was kind of silent for a while, but in films and TV, whenever there was an Asian character, they kind of did like tropes, like in X2, Lady Deathstroke kind of played off the sexy dragon lady badass trope, and then Elektra was heavily relied on weird Asian mysticism and Orientalism. But one series that really came out in prominence for Asian representation is Young Justice in the form of Artemis being a biracial with her mom being Vietnamese, and one of the caveats at the time was she was voiced by a white lady, and the whole sister being a ninja motif, which was kind of, hitting on it a little bit too hard. But hey man, at that time I took what I got, and it was one of the few times I noticed Asian representation. And then there was Big Hero 6, to me that felt like it subverted some Asian stereotypes and then relied heavily on others, but I think that's something for another video that I'd like to talk about. But then we have things like Arrow and the Wolverine that straight up was just white dude who goes to Asian country to learn to be best at Asian things. Neither are bad, but they heavily used a lot of outdated tropes about samurais and honor and stuff like that, as well as the recent Twitter thread of Jimmy Wong calling out the bad portrayals of Asians in superhero media with the tropes of the silent badass and how it isn't cool, but it takes away a chance for Asian characters to have more nuance. The reason I bring this up is because we need to talk about how the Marvel Studios and their adjacent companies like the Netflix series kind of relied heavily or tried to ignore the Asian influences in their shows, the racial coding and stereotypes in the TV and films of Marvel Studios. So when I think of Marvel TV and movies handling of Asian representation, I obviously jump and think about Iron Fist, but I think all the Netflix series centered around the hand had this problem of pseudo-Orientalism. Like Luke Cage and Jessica Jones got to shine a light on strong leads for African Americans and women. And I do really like Daredevil a lot. It is a fantastic series, but I do have to agree Iron Fist and Daredevil, whose characters are both heavily inspired by martial arts and Eastern culture as a whole, treated their Asian bad guys as just that, poor Asian bad guy stereotypes. Madame Gao was depicted as this cold-hearted dragon lady, and Nobu was just, I'm a ninja man. They didn't even speak English and had to have translators talk for them. In a think piece called Black Mask Yellow Peril, Anti-Asianism in Netflix's otherwise brilliant Daredevil, writer Takeo Rivero wrote this: among the villains, Wilson Fisk has provided the most complexity and depth, seducing the viewer into sympathizing with him. The other white American villains, Wesley and Leland, are not specifically racialized in their roles and could be easily colorblindly swapped. The Russian mobsters are certainly ethnicized quite strongly throughout the show, but are given thorough backgrounds, and one of them even exhibits a change of heart and sacrifices himself to help Daredevil in his final moment. Nobu and Gao come only in one flavor, inscrutable, mysterious menace. They aren't villains who happen to be Asian. Their Asianness is central to their villainous. I'm not going to argue that East Asian investments is indeed contributing to displacement of the urban oppressed as is portrayed in Daredevil. In fact, the show's confrontation of the issue in general is extremely commendable. But the biggest problem is that Asian Americans, many of whom are older Chinese ladies who don't look unlike Gao, are often also the victims of such corporate displacement and gentrification. The visibility of these Asian corporate fiends, paired with the utter lack of Asian American characters, much less Asian American poor, reinforces a monolithic image of Asians as synonymous with foreign oppressors. It's the kind of logic that motivated anti-Asian events from 1882's Chinese Exclusion Act all the way to the hate crime murder of Vincent Chin in Detroit 100 years later in 1982. As well as both Daredevil and Iron Fist have a white savior parallels and complexes, where the two female love interests, mind you, are both Asian and start off evil, it takes the white dude to see the errors of their ways, as well as Iron Fist being centered around one of the best martial artists and having some of the shittiest fight scenes. And one could say, maybe I'm being hyperbolic talking about this, I am maybe reading too much into this. However, in 2022, at the Save the Daredevil Con, actor who played Nobu, Peter Shinkodo, said this about Jeph Loab when the writers told him that he and actress of Madame Gao, Wao Shang-ho, they were working on adding some more depth and nuance to their character. Jeph Loab told the writers' room not to write for Nobu and Gao, and this was reiterated many times by many of the writers and showrunners. He said, "Nobody cares about Chinese people and Asian people. There were 3 previous Marvel movies, a trilogy called Blade that was made where Wesley Snipes killed 200 Asians each movie. Nobody gives a shit, so don't write about Nobu and Gao. Their hands were tied." Shinkoda has no blame or malice towards the writers, which is understandable, but I can't imagine this is actually something Jeph Loab would say, because he dressed as the fucking Karate Kid to promote Iron Fist Season 2, where after the promotion, Asian actress and one of the main leads of Iron Fist, Jessica Henwick, forced him to remove the costume, while also shutting down the possibility of making a biracial Iron Fist because Danny being white made him an outsider. One can say he is a tone-deaf old man of a bygone era, and the shift to Disney Plus has meant Loab is no longer working with Marvel for the most part, but if I could give him the benefit of the doubt, he was a producer on The Runaways and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which had strong Asian female leads. Before 2021, the MCU for me really relied heavily on Asian stereotypes or just having Asian characters for tokenism. The reason I say this is because when I look at the Asian characters in the MCU, their agency heavily relies on those stereotypes. Mantis, although technically an alien, is played by a biracial Asian actress, Pom Klementieff, but she is coded with the stereotype of the submissive Asian woman and the lotus blossom. And Spider-Man's Ned, when he is first introduced, is the stereotypical Asian nerd sidekick to Peter Parker. But obviously people are here waiting for me to talk about Marvel's biggest sin towards Asian representation, and that is in Doctor Strange. And that was Wong being your stereotypical Asian sidekick, and Stephen Strange being the outsider that appropriates the Asian mysticism and is the best magician ever. Is what I would be saying, but we know I'm talking about, the casting of Tilda Swinton as the Ancient One and the whitewashing of the character. So when the news was announced, there was a lot of backlash about her casting because the creative team behind it, director Scott Derrickson, and Marvel thought it was a good subversion because they thought if they hire an Asian actor, it would be stereotypical. But when asked about why not Asian actresses instead of an Asian actor, Derrickson said this: "The first decision that I made was to make it a woman before we ever went to draft, before we ever had a script. As we started to work on it, my assumption was that it would be an Asian character, that it would be an Asian woman. We talked about Asian actors who could do it as we were working on the script, every iteration of it, including the one that Tilda played, but when they envisioned that character being played by an Asian actress, it was straight up Dragon Lady. I know the history of cinema and the portrayal of the Dragon Lady in anime Wong films and the continued stereotype throughout film history and even more in television. I just didn't feel like there was any way to get around that because the Dragon Lady, by definition, is a domineering, powerful, secretive, mysterious Asian woman of age with duplicitous motives, and I just described Tilda Swinton's character. I really felt like I was going to be contributing to a bad stereotype." So when I hear this whole talking about her being a dragon lady is wrong because the dragon lady trope is a sexual deviant and a femme fatale. Secondly, this kind of seems like a you problem that no matter that you and your writing team could do was rely on the dragon lady tropes, because they also claim they changed Wong from being a manservant but still made him the wise Asian mystic man to Stephen Strange. So let's be real, I have no problem with casting an actress as the Ancient One, but again, it feels weird because you chose a white lady who's been the Ancient One for centuries, and the next in line for the Sorcerer Supreme is another white person. It's just a kind of uncomfortable to me, but I think the weirdest scenario is how Tilda Swinton handled it. She tried to reach out to Margaret Cho. Cho was offended because she had never met Swinton before. The comedian then told fellow comic Bobby Lee on the podcast that Swinton wanted to get my take on why all the Asian people were so mad, and it was so weird. Swinton then published her whole exchange with Cho on Jezebel. Cho explained to Swinton in exchange that Asian and Asian American stories are told by white actors over and over again, and we feel at a loss to know how to cope with it. Swinton told Cho that diversity is pretty much her comfort zone, and the idea of being caught in the wrong side of this debate is a bit of a nightmare to me. As noted by Variety, Cho later said, however, that the interaction made her feel like a house Asian because she had been asked to explain whitewashing on behalf of all Asian Americans to someone she had never met, a request that, however well-intentioned, highlighted Swinton's white privilege and fragility. And this is the one thing that gets me after all this. This is kind of proof that Marvel made a bad call, because after the success of Shang-Chi, Kevin Feige said this about the whole Ancient One whitewashing scenario. We thought we were being so smart and so cutting edge. We're not going to do the cliche of wizened old wise Asian man, but it was a wake-up call to say, well, wait a minute, is there any other way to figure it out? Is there any other way to not fall into cliche and cast an Asian actor? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. I want to end this part with the MCU and Asian coding with this, compared to the comics industry and how certain TV executives acted with blissful ignorance because they thought they were right. Kevin Feige saying this was a breath of fresh air, doing research on this because holy shit was it getting disheartening to find people's quotes about Asian representation. So we have talked about the history of Asians in comics, the origins of Shang-Chi, the problematic history of the comic industries, the lack of representation of Asian superheroes in TV and media, and how the MCU in both TV and movie form handled and coded Asian characters. All of this leads to why Shang-Chi is important, because Shang-Chi broke barriers, Shang-Chi subverts its history, and Shang-Chi shows that Asian-led films sell. Marvel greenlit Shang-Chi after the director Destin Creton pitched his idea for a Shang-Chi movie. But he didn't pitch a grandiose kung fu epic, but pitched his idea of Shang-Chi as a journey of father and son trying to understand each other. Creton said this while describing Shang-Chi's journey. I really personally connected with Shang-Chi's journey. I love that this is a superhero that doesn't get splashed with chemicals to get his superpower, that it is a journey of self-discovery, of how growing up, of learning how to finally deal with the pain that he's running away from his entire life, and that when he is finally able to look inside into his past and embrace good, bad, the joy, the pain, and accept it all as part of himself, that's when he finally steps into his big boy shoes. And I don't know, I think that's kind of what we're all doing as humans in some way or another, so I really connect with that. Yeah, in the end, Shang-Chi is saving the world, but most of this movie is heavily centered around Shang-Chi interacting with his past, present, future, and colliding together to make him the superhero we see at the end. David Callihem, the writer of Shang-Chi, talked about what they did to make Shang-Chi feel both relatable to the audience as well as relatable to being Asian in America. I have had the emotional experience of wanting to hide from one half of who I am. I'm half Chinese, so that's the half I'm referring to. I grew up in the area that was not predominantly Asian, so I often felt overlooked or othered. There's a lot of different stuff that went into my experience of Asianness that made me not want to embrace that, to try not to stick out, and to try to embrace my Caucasian side a bit more. Now, Shang-Chi is not having that specific experience. He's running away from his father, who is a literal 1,000-year-old warlord, but it's all just a metaphor for identity, right? So yeah, I was definitely able to draw quite a bit emotionally from my life. It was wonderful. It was important to me that Asian audiences felt seen, so any references or any experience that I had that I thought might be validating to an Asian audience member, I wrote in. But the cool thing about our movie is that those things came from everywhere. It is a massive community of Asian people from all over, having had different experiences and sharing them with us. That's really what led to all the Asian cultural references you see in the film, the experience of our entire cast and crew, not just Destin and I putting the words on the page. And yeah, man, this movie hit home for me for a lot of reasons because I spent my youth being ashamed of being raised Asian and trying to suppress that side of me. There was an off comment that Shang-Chi says about being made fun of for just being Asian, and it hit me hard. The thing about Shang-Chi in The Legend of the Ten Rings is, yeah, it's based off of the Marvel comic book character Shang-Chi, Master of Kung Fu, but it isn't Shang-Chi, Master of Kung Fu. The source material, as I've talked about, was a little problematic, so this gave the creators free range to make Shang-Chi their own. David Callihem told Marvel this is how he wanted to write Shang-Chi. No one has ever asked me to write a story about an Asian guy. I was blunt with Marvel from day one. I said, I want to talk about what it means to be Asian in America. I wanted this because I felt strongly Asian stories hadn't been represented in Western media. I thought it's critical to express what we go through so people can see us as three-dimensional people we are. And the first thing they did was repurpose two Yellow Peril-inspired characters, the Mandarin and Fu Manchu. Now, making the Mandarin the father of Shang-Chi instead of Fu Manchu wasn't an original concept. It actually happened in a one-shot during the Battleworld Saga, an alternate universe where Shang-Chi was a drunken master and his father was a hybrid of the Mandarin and his actual father in the comics at the time going by Zhang Xu, but formerly known as Fu Manchu. But one of the biggest things they wanted to do was destroy stereotypes. And why not destroy the biggest and most iconic stereotype that has been part of the media for ages? And the way to do that is to humanize a character, and they cast the perfect actor to do so, Tony Leung. He is famous in China and Hong Kong cinema, but the man is such an amazing actor. Tony made the character his own. He wasn't the Mandarin, he was Wenwu, the best Marvel villain. The title doesn't matter, it is the man behind the title. Destin Daniel explained working with Luong and how the writing team shaped Wenwu. When I was talking to Tony about this character, he didn't know who the Mandarin is and didn't care. We weren't using the name Wenwu, but we're definitely not talking about the Mandarin. There were elements of the Mandarin of the character that remained, but we were talking about a dad who experienced a major loss in his life and has spiraled into despair and psychosis and trying to desperately get back the thing that he lost. That was the character we're talking about. There was a point when it was just weird in the writing process avoiding that name because nobody would call him that. It just never felt right for someone to say, oh yes, Mr. Mandarin, and so we knew we had to give him a name. Even in the script, he would be called the Mandarin, but when people would talk about him to his face, it was Wenwu, which was the name that we gave him. That was the name that Tony clung to, and eventually it found its way into the scene where Tony explains that the Mandarin is one of many names, but that his one true love of his life was the only one who called him by his actual name. From a character standpoint, I feel like the process of breaking stereotypes is really just trying to humanize the character as much as possible, give them as many sides as we could, make sure that each character had something clearly human about them that they were dealing with that we can all connect to, whether you are of a similar ethnic background or not. To me, that is when stereotypes are broken, when you see yourself in a character. You see, Wenwu isn't your stereotypical villain who's trying to take over the world. He's a man who's grieving and in pain, longing for his past, and pushing his family away instead of opening up to them. Wenwu is human because the people writing him are reflecting their feelings and emotions in him. Not only are they subverting Fu Manchu's racist past, they're giving a much needed nuance to the tiger parent trope. Originally referenced as Tiger Mother when Amy Chow published her controversial book in 2011, The Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, did those inside and outside of the Asian community realize the totality of this parenting style. In her book, Chow described tiger moms as tough, disciplinarian mothers, often of East Asian American, South Asian American, and Southeast Asian American households. Though Chow admitted that the harsh parenting style transcends race, and though the stereotype targets moms, tiger dads exist too. TV tiger parents can exuberate the model minority myth, in part because of the stereotype arose from it. The flawed, oversimplified theory characterized Asian Americans as the best immigrants. As long as you work hard, stay quiet, and never complain about hardships, you will find success in the United States. But again, subverting a trope is just to give it nuance and understand why people do what they do. Tiger parents aren't doing this because they hate their kids and want them to suffer. Most of them are in survival mode because they left a country that was hard to live in and were trying to survive. They just don't want their kids to struggle like they did. And yes, it's extremely fucked up. Most tiger parents' methods can be flawed, but their intent was never out of malice, and Wenwu embodied that after his loss of his wife, and he didn't want to lose his children, so he pushed Shang and tried to protect Xiaoxing from ever losing them like they did her, but in reality it just caused a bigger rift, but he was doing what he thought was right to protect them and their love. Wenwu shows why the tiger parent trope is harmful because all you ever see is these cold, emotionless parents pushing their kids to the edge, but they have love for their children and sometimes they don't know how to express that love well. I am going to be honest, when I first heard the first Asian-led Marvel superhero film was going to be about the Asian character who was good at martial arts, I kind of rolled my eyes because of course they would choose to do one of the most stereotypical tropes. But I was wrong. I was very, very wrong because yes, Shang-Chi is still a form of cultural appropriation. They managed to make a martial arts Hollywood film that feels like a love letter and homage to classic kung fu without coming off extremely orientalist. This is because some of the fight scenes were choreographed by the late Brad Allen, who was part of Jackie Chan's stunt team, as well as other people from Jackie Chan's stunt team working on the film. They took time to incorporate the martial arts as more than just an aesthetic. The fight scenes for the most part push the narrative and also elevate the story they are trying to tell. It comes off as a love letter to the evolution of kung fu films, from the Shaw Brothers style fight scenes telling the story of Wenwu, to the wuxia inspired fight scene between Wenwu and his wife Ying Li, to the Jackie Chan inspired bus fight scene at the start of the film, to the homage to films like Kung Fu Hustle, and even having Hong Kong cinema veteran Yan Hua have a role in the film, to the subtle and involuntary homage to Bruce Lee with the water in the end credits showing off the martial arts flowing like water, like Bruce would always say. Martial arts had to be in the DNA of Shang-Chi because of who the character is, but they took their time to give each person who uses martial arts their own unique fighting style, and the best place you can tell this is the fight between Wenwu and Ying Li in their first meeting. Wenwu uses hard-hitting tiger-style fighting because of his aggressive nature, while Ying Li uses Tai Chi, which is always about gentle movements and displacing force. They create a sense of yin and yang that is mirrored in the end of the fight scene between Shang-Chi and Wenwu, when Shang-Chi must realize he carries both of their styles at the end of the film. One of my other favorite things is they talk about the subtle cultural appropriation and xenophobia that was present in the Iron Man film series with the Ten Rings, as Wenwu explains how Aldrich Killian got away with it, even bringing back Ben Kingsley as Trevor Slattery as some kind of meta joke of how silly and weird that this was a real thing that happens when it comes to the fear-mongering and possibility of foreigners, as well as the same dinner scene when Wenwu grills Katie on using her real name and not an Americanized name, and trying to understand that yes, you are American, but your roots are Asian and you shouldn't be ashamed of that. Then that speech is later realized by Shang-Chi himself in his final battle with his father Wenwu. As he is battling it out and he accepts both sides of him, it is seen through not only his fighting style, but his ensemble costume. From his father's 10 rings now in his possession, his mother's scale-bound armor from Dragon Scale, and from his time being in America, his sweet-ass Nike kicks. But Shang-Chi's entire story is about identity and who we are. And to be honest with you, it's a universal story, but a lot of Asian children who are biracial or second-generation immigrants understand that a lot more. And you can relate to Shang-Chi because when you meet him, he isn't a kick-ass kung fu master, but a lost young adult trying to find himself and his purpose in the world, as well as a subtle scene almost every Asian kid has felt when Shang-Chi and his friends are talking about the weird and awkward stuff people said to them because they're Asian. So this leads me to the main cast of amazing characters. Simu Liu is a treat to watch, and he is able to turn this one-dimensional kung fu man of the 80s tropes into an actual human being that is struggling with who he is. And Awkwafina as Katie is just a treat to have to help cut the tension when things get too heavy. But what shines to me is the fact that they have a platonic relationship and it's still a compelling partnership is such a treat instead of having a romantic leads, as well as being the first millennial characters with a different perspective in the Marvel Universe. I think these two deserve so much praise. Obviously, we have had Snake Eyes that came out this year, and Raya and the Last Dragon coming out this year with a huge cast of Asian lead characters. Shang-Chi also has a lead Asian cast as well, but I think it does it maybe a little bit better. Not only do you have the lead actors like Simu Liu, Tony Leung, and Awkwafina, but the director and writer is of Asian descent as well in Destin Daniel Creton and David Callihem, as well as their design team and their martial arts stunt team. And everything about this feels genuinely Asian, and it feels like they took the time to take care of the cultures they want to reference and doesn't seem like racial virtue signaling we saw in things like Mulan 2020. I'm very sorry I had to make that jab, but it's just a thing. But one of the most subtle things that not many people will think about is that we get to see Simu Liu's name on a poster. The fact that Simu Liu is an actor that didn't have to change his name to a more Western sounding name like Sam Lee and can use his actual name is a milestone in media, because 5 years ago it may have been a different story. Even Bruce Lee didn't use his real name, Li Junfan, and had to use an Americanized name. It's a good subtle change because people in the film like Michelle Yeoh, whose real name is Michelle Yeoh Chu Huang, was told when she was trying to break into Hollywood that Chu Huang would be too hard to pronounce for Western audiences and it would detract her career. Seeing Simu Liu is Shang-Chi is meaningful because a lot of Asian actors felt obligated to change their names because it was too Asian. But I do just have a few minor nitpicks about the film. One thing that recent comics and the recent film does is erase Shang-Chi's biracial identity. I know the reason they did it in the comics in the early 70s is because they didn't think an Asian lead would sell, but I think it would have added a layer of nuance to understanding who Shang-Chi is when it comes to fitting into the world that a lot of second-generation immigrant kids and biracial kids feel when they are young, and it could have made a bigger connection to us. I also am not a huge fan as the movie went on. The emotional martial arts scenes got consumed by your stereotypical Marvel final fight scene. Again, these are minor nitpicks to a film that I think was a refreshing Marvel film since Guardians of the Galaxy. After talking about all the hurdles from the sordid history of Shang-Chi, the comics industry, how Marvel has treated its Asian characters, it is amazing to see the success of Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. A year ago, I started writing video essays focused on racial coding and stereotypes of Asians in our media because I thought there was something weird and I thought we needed to talk about it. And a year later, I feel like we've had this Asians in pop culture renaissance. We aren't just stereotypical characters like the wise ancient master, the dragon lady, the nerdy sidekick, or the silent badass. We are actual people with nuance and emotion. Things like Invincible, Raya the Last Dragon, and Shang-Chi are milestones, and they're important to push for more authentic portrayals of who we are as people of Asian descent. We are diverse and we are in this together. So this is how I had to unpack and understand how we got Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings and its impact. I started this video with a clip of a candid story of Simu Liu talking about having to be Spider-Man at a kid's birthday because he had to wear a mask, well, because he was Asian. So I want to end with this video clip.
You were right. I'm not Spider-Man. I'm Shang-Chi, bitch!
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you made it at the end of the video, thank you very much. It means a lot. This was a labor of love that I enjoyed working on. This is obviously the final project of the year, so I wanted to make it big, and I think I did. I'm going to be doing a big move at the end of February, so I'm thinking about taking a break and focusing on that. But see you next year, and thanks for watching. And whatever you're going through, you've got this, cowboy.